July 18th, 1944. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley stood in his command post in Normandy, reading casualty reports from the American sector. 6 weeks after D-Day, 6 weeks of brutal fighting in the Norman Hedge. 6 weeks of American soldiers dying in narrow lanes between ancient stone walls and earthen banks overgrown with vegetation so thick a man couldn't see 10 yards ahead. Bradley's First Army had suffered over 40,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. They were stuck in terrain that made every field a fortress and every hedger a killing ground. The Germans were fighting desperately, but they weren't the only problem. The real problem was 6 miles to the east, the city of Caen. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had promised to capture Caen on D-Day. He had sworn to Eisenhower that British forces would take this critical road junction within hours of landing and push inland to give the Allies room to maneuver. 6 weeks later, Caen was still in German hands. Montgomery's entire army was stuck outside a city heat, promised to take on June 6th. And because Montgomery was stuck, the Germans could concentrate their armored reserves against the Americans. Every panzer division that wasn't fighting the British was killing Americans in the hedge. Bradley looked at the casualty reports again. These weren't just numbers. These were farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit. They were dying because Montgomery had failed. And Montgomery was now claiming his failure had been the plan all along. This is the story of how Montgomery's broken promise at Caen nearly destroyed the Normandy invasion. How American soldiers paid in blood for British failure. And how George S. Patton had to save D-Day from a disaster Montgomery refused to admit existed. Operation Overlord was developed over 18 months, the largest amphibious invasion in history. British and Canadian forces would land on the eastern beaches, Gold, Juno, and soared with KH as their primary objective. K was critical. Road junction connecting Normandy to Paris. Open terrain beyond it, perfect for armored warfare. If the Allies captured Caen quickly, they could push inland and prevent the Germans from containing the invasion. Montgomery promised Eisenhower he would take Caen on D-Day, not D+1, not within a week. On D-Day itself, June 6th, 1944, British forces would secure the city by nightfall and push south toward Filettes within days. American forces would land on Utah and Omaha beaches, capture the Codentown Peninsula and the port of Cherbourg. Critical for logistics, but secondary to Montgomery's push inland from Caen. The plan depended on speed. German panzer divisions were in France. If the Allies got stuck on the beaches, the panzers would counterattack. Montgomery had to break inland fast. Montgomery assured everyone he understood the stakes. He would not fail. Caen would fall on D-Day, and the breakout would begin immediately. June 6, 1944. British and Canadian forces stormed ashore on the eastern beaches. The landings were successful. Casualties were lighter than expected. By mid-morning, thousands of troops were moving inland toward Caen. The British 3rd Infantry Division pushed south from Sword Beach. Their objective was Caen, 6 miles east inland. The terrain was open. The Germans had minimal forces in position. The path to Caen was vulnerable. But Montgomery's plan had a fatal flaw. He had prioritized logistics over speed. British forces paused to consolidate their beachhead. They waited for artillery to be landed. They organized supply lines before advancing. They were being cautious when they should have been aggressive. By afternoon, German reinforcements were arriving. The 21st Panzer Division counterattacked between the British and Canadian sectors. They didn't push the Allies back to the beaches, but they stopped the advance toward Caen. By nightfall on June 6th, British forces were still 3 miles from the city. Montgomery's promise was already broken. Kay had not fallen on D-Day, but Montgomery didn't seem concerned. He told Eisenhower the delay was temporary. British forces would resume the advance. The next morning, Caen would fall within days. June 7th came and went. British forces attacked toward Kay and were stopped by German defenders. June 8th, same result. June 9th, still stuck. The Germans were rushing panzer divisions to Normandy, and every one of them was being sent to stop the British at Caen. By June 10th, 4 days after D-Day, it was clear Montgomery's plan had failed. Caen was not going to fall quickly. The British were stuck in a grinding battle on the approaches to the city. The open terrain Montgomery had promised to capture was in German hands. The British were stuck, and because they were stuck, the American nightmare was about to begin. At German headquarters in France, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was making a critical decision. He had limited panzer divisions to defend against the Allied invasion. He had to decide where to concentrate his armor. Would he focus on the British sector at Kay or the American sector in the west? The British were clearly trying to take Caen. Montgomery's attacks made his intentions obvious. If the British broke through at Caen, they could drive deep into France. The terrain was good for tanks. They could threaten Paris. The Americans in the western sector were stuck in the bocage, the Norman hedge, terrain that was nightmare for armored warfare. Small fields separated by ancient earthen banks topped with thick hedges and stone walls. Narrow sunken lanes, every field a natural fortress. Rommel made his choice. He would concentrate his panzers against the British at Caen. The 21st Panzer Division was already there. He sent the 12th SS Panzer Division, then the Panzerlehr Division. The 1st SS Panzer Division followed. These were Germany's best units with the newest tanks. By mid-June, 7 German panzer divisions were concentrated around Caen. Over 500 tanks. These were the divisions that could have counterattacked the American beaches. They could have crushed Bradley's forces while they were still consolidating. Instead, they were all fighting Montgomery. This was exactly what Montgomery would later claim he intended. He would say he deliberately attracted German armor to hold it in place while Americans broke out. But in June 1944, Montgomery wasn't claiming this was his plan. He was attacking Caen repeatedly, trying desperately to break through. The British were fighting hard, but they couldn't break through. 7 panzer divisions, and every day they stayed stuck at KH was another day the Americans had to fight without facing German armor. The Germans couldn't send panzers to fight the Americans because they needed every tank to stop the British. Montgomery had unintentionally created a shield for Bradley's forces. But that shield came with a terrible price. While Montgomery fought panzers at Caen, American soldiers were dying in a different kind of hell. The bocage, the Norman hedge. Thousands of small fields separated by banks of earth, 4 feet high, topped with thick vegetation and ancient trees. These weren't garden hedges. They were centuries-old fortifications. The roots were so thick they could stop a 30-ton tank. When a Sherman tried to climb over, its exposed underbelly pointed at the sky, a perfect target for a German anti-tank shell. The Germans turned every hedge row into a defensive position. They put machine guns covering the narrow lanes between fields. They placed mortars in positions where Americans couldn't see them. They mined the approaches and waited for Americans to advance into killing zones. American infantry had to attack across open fields toward hedge rows they couldn't see through. German machine guns cut them down before they could close the distance. If they made it to the hedger row, Germans on the other side threw grenades over the top. If Americans breached one hedger row, there was another one 100 yards away. American tanks couldn't help. When they tried to push through hedge rows, they exposed their thin belly armor. Germans with Panzer destroyed them from hiding positions. The bocage neutralized American advantages in armor and air power. The casualty rate was horrifying. Companies lost 50% of their strength in days. Regiments were decimated, attacking objectives measured in hundreds of yards. Divisions suffered thousands of casualties for gains measured in miles. The First Army was being ground down in the worst fighting American forces had seen in Europe. Bradley understood what was happening. His soldiers were paying the price for Montgomery's failure at Caen. If Montgomery had taken Caen on D-Day as promised, the front would have opened up. Americans could have maneuvered in open terrain instead of being trapped in the bocage. Instead, the Germans could concentrate their attention on the hedge. They knew Montgomery wasn't going anywhere at Caen. They could put experienced infantry against the Americans and make every yard costly. By early July, American casualties exceeded 40,000. Nearly one-third of Bradley's assault divisions were casualties. Replacements were arriving, but they were inexperienced. They died, learning lessons that wouldn't have been necessary if Montgomery had kept his promise. June 26, 1944, Operation Epsom began. 3 British divisions attacked west of Caen, trying to encircle the city. Montgomery committed his reserves. This would be the decisive push that finally broke German defenses. The British attacked with massive artillery support. Hundreds of guns fired preparatory barges. Infantry advanced behind creeping barges. Tanks followed in support. It looked like overwhelming force. It should have worked, but the Germans were dug in and ready. The same panzer divisions that had stopped previous attacks stopped this one. German tanks engaged British armor at long range. German infantry held their positions. The British advance measured progress in hundreds of yards per day. By June 30th, Operation Epsom had failed. British forces had pushed a salient across the Odin River, but couldn't exploit. German counterattacks threatened to cut off the advance. Montgomery ordered his forces to dig in and consolidate their positions. Caen was still in German hands. 3 weeks had passed, and the primary D-Day objective remained an impregnable fortress. His excuses were wearing thin. Churchill was furious. British newspapers were openly questioning Montgomery's competence. Eisenhower met with Montgomery on July 1st. The meeting was tense. Eisenhower demanded to know when Caen would fall and when the British would break through. The Americans couldn't stay trapped in the bocage forever. Bradley's divisions were being destroyed. Montgomery promised another offensive. This one would be even bigger. He would use heavy bombers to carpet bomb German positions. British armor would smash through in overwhelming force. Operation Goodwood. It would begin in mid-July. This time he would not fail. Eisenhower had heard this before, but he approved Goodwood anyway. The alternative was to admit the Normandy campaign was stalemated. July 18, 1944. The same day Bradley was reading his casualty reports, Operation Goodwood began with the largest air bombardment in support of ground operations the Allies had yet conducted. Over 2,000 bombers dropped 7,000 tons of bombs on German positions east of Caen. The bombing devastated German forward positions. 3 British armored divisions moved forward. Over 700 tanks. This was the breakthrough. Finally, after 6 weeks of stalling, Montgomery had the overwhelming force to crush the resistance. The British tanks advanced through the bombed area. They made good progress initially. For a few hours, it looked like success. Montgomery sent optimistic reports to Eisenhower. The breakthrough was happening. The Germans were retreating. Then, German forces that hadn't been hit by the bombing counterattacked. 88mm guns hidden in villages destroyed British tanks at long range. German panzers that had survived the bombing moved into defensive positions. British armor ran into a killing zone. By the end of July 18th, the British advance had stalled. They had gained a few miles, but hadn't broken through. German defenses held. Over the next 2 days, the British lost over 400 tanks trying to push forward. Operation Goodwood was grinding to a halt. Montgomery called off the offensive on July 20th. He claimed it had been a success. British forces had captured the ruins of eastern Caen. They had inflicted heavy casualties on the Germans. He portrayed Goodwood as a victory. But Eisenhower knew the truth. Goodwood had failed to break through German defenses. The British had lost 400 tanks and 5,000 casualties for a few miles of devastated ground. Montgomery had promised a breakthrough. He had delivered another costly stalemate. Churchill was so angry he almost fired Montgomery. Only intervention from British military leadership prevented it. But Montgomery's credibility with Eisenhower was gone. The British weren't going to break through at Caen. 6 weeks after D-Day, that was clear. The Americans would have to do it themselves. After Goodwood failed, Montgomery began telling a new story. He hadn't been trying to break through at Caen. His real objective had been to hold German armor in place. Every panzer fighting the British was a panzer that couldn't fight the Americans. Montgomery claimed this had been his plan all along from before D-Day. He said he had intended to draw German forces to the British sector. The attacks on Caen weren't failures. They were deliberate attritional battles designed to fix German attention while Americans prepared their breakout. This was a lie. Montgomery's planning documents from before D-Day proved it. His orders to subordinate commanders proved it. His promises to Eisenhower about taking Caen on D-Day proved it. He had intended to break through, and it failed. Now he was claiming failure had been the plan. But the Americans who fought in Normandy knew better. Bradley knew. Patton knew. The American generals understood exactly what had happened. Montgomery had failed to deliver what he promised. American soldiers paid the price in the hedge. Montgomery was now claiming credit for a strategy he had been forced into by his own failure. The lie was politically brilliant. It protected Montgomery's reputation. It gave him credit for American success that was coming. It allowed the British to maintain the fiction that Montgomery was successfully executing his master plan. But it was still a lie, and everyone who had read Montgomery's original plans knew it. Eisenhower couldn't publicly contradict Montgomery without creating an alliance crisis. So he accepted Montgomery's new narrative outwardly while privately planning to sideline him. The Americans would break out. Montgomery could claim whatever he wanted afterward. Bradley had been planning the American breakout for weeks. He couldn't wait for Montgomery anymore. If the Americans were going to escape the Bocage, they would have to do it themselves without British support. The plan was Operation Cobra. Bradley would concentrate First Army for a massive assault near St. Lo. Heavy bombers would carpet bomb German positions. American forces would punch through the weakened defenses, and exploit into open country beyond. Bradley had one critical advantage. The Germans were still concentrating against Montgomery. 7 panzer divisions at Caen. The German infantry facing the Americans were good soldiers, but they didn't have armor support. If Bradley could break their line, there was open country beyond. Bradley had one other advantage. While the generals were arguing, American soldiers improvised. A sergeant named Curtis Cullen welded steel scraps from German beach obstacles onto the front of Sherman tanks. They called them Rhino tanks. They didn't climb the hedges. They cut right through them. American ingenuity was ready to do what British planning couldn't. The key was speed. Once American forces broke through, they had to move fast before Germans could shift panzers from Caen to block them. This required aggressive exploitation. Someone who wouldn't stop to consolidate. Someone who would keep advancing until ordered to halt. Bradley had exactly the right general waiting. George S. Patton, America's most aggressive combat commander, the general who had raced Montgomery to Messina in Sicily. The general who understood mobile warfare better than anyone in the American Army. Patton's Third Army was activated on August 1st, 1944. But Patton had been in Normandy since mid-July, secretly planning the exploitation phase of Cobra. He had studied the maps. He knew exactly where he would go once the breakthrough happened. Eisenhower gave Bradley operational control of American forces. Montgomery would command the British, but he would no longer control American operations. Bradley could execute Cobra when ready. If it succeeded, Patton would lead the breakout. The Americans were going to finish what Montgomery had promised to do 7 weeks earlier. July 25, 1944, Operation Cobra began. Over 1,500 heavy bombers and 400 medium bombers attacked German positions near St. Lo. They dropped nearly 4,000 tons of bombs on a 4M wide strip of front line. The bombing devastated German forward positions. Infantry and support weapons were destroyed or scattered. Communications broke down. Survivors were stunned. Some units ceased to exist as organized forces. American infantry attacked immediately after the bombing. The 7th Corps, under Major General J. Ulton Collins, pushed through the crater ground. German resistance was sporadic. The line was broken. By evening of July 25th, American forces had penetrated German defenses. July 26th and 27th, the breakthrough widened. More American divisions poured through the gap. German attempts to counterattack failed. The entire German defensive position in western Normandy was collapsing. Bradley committed his reserves to exploit. On July 28th, American forces broke into open country, beyond the bocage, beyond the hedge, tank country. The kind of terrain where American armor and air power could dominate. The kind of breakthrough Montgomery had promised to achieve at Caen 6 weeks earlier. The Germans rushed reinforcements from Brittany to plug the gap, but they couldn't shift panzers from Caen. Montgomery's attacks, failures though they had been, had fixed German armor in place. The Germans couldn't respond to Bradley's breakthrough with their best divisions. By July 31st, American forces were pouring through the St. Lo Gap. The Normandy stalemate was broken. After 6 weeks of grinding combat, the Americans had done what Montgomery couldn't do. They had broken out, and George Patton was about to make Montgomery look even worse. August 1st, 1944, Patton's Third Army became operational. His mission was to exploit the Cobra breakthrough. He was supposed to swing west into Brittany to capture ports. Then he would reorganize for future operations. Patton looked at the strategic situation and immediately understood that the plan was obsolete. The German army in Normandy was broken. Their defenses were collapsing. The path east was wide open. Ports in Brittany didn't matter if the war could be won before they were needed. Patton made a command decision. He would send one corps to Brittany to fulfill the letter of his orders, but the rest of Third Army would go east toward Paris, toward the German border. He would exploit the German collapse until he ran out of gas or got new orders to stop. Bradley understood what Patton was doing and quietly approved. Eisenhower was informed after Patton was already moving. By the time anyone could countermand the orders, Third Army was advancing so fast it would be impossible to stop them. Patton's divisions moved faster than any army had moved in modern warfare. They covered 50 m in days, then 100 miles, then 200. They liberated French towns so quickly German defenders were caught by surprise. French citizens woke up to find American tanks rolling through streets. The Germans tried to retreat in order, but Patton kept cutting them off. His armor moved faster than German infantry could march. His cavalry reconnaissance found gaps and exploited them before Germans could establish new defensive lines. By mid-August, Third Army had advanced further, in 2 weeks than British forces had advanced in 2 months. Patton had gone from Normandy to the Seine River. He had done in 14 days what Montgomery had promised to do on D-Day and still hadn't accomplished 6 weeks later. Montgomery responded by claiming credit for American success. He told British media that the American breakout had succeeded because he had held German armor at Caen. He had created the conditions for American success. Bradley and Patton were executing Montgomery's master plan. American generals were furious. Patton had succeeded despite Montgomery, not because of him. If Montgomery had taken Caen on D-Day as promised, the breakout would have happened in June, not August. Thousands of American casualties in the Bocage were Montgomery's responsibility. By September 1st, Patton was approaching the German border. In 3 months, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and liberated most of France. The Normandy campaign was over, but it had taken 3 months to do what Montgomery claimed he could do in 1 day. After the war, Allied intelligence interrogated surviving German generals who had fought in Normandy. Their testimony revealed the truth about Montgomery's claims. General Hans Aberbach commanded Panzer Group West at Caen. After his capture in August 1944, he gave extensive testimony to U.S. Army historians. He stated that the Germans concentrated panzers at KH because that's where the British were attacking. The German defense was dictated by British attacks, not by some British deception plan. The Germans were holding at K because they couldn't afford to lose the position. If the British broke through, they could drive into France. General Fritz Berlin of Panzerlehr Division gave similar testimony after his capture in 1945. He said the British attacks at Caen were serious breakthrough attempts. Operation Goodwood particularly convinced Germans that the British were trying to break out. The massive bombing and tank assault was clearly meant to shatter German defenses. None of the German generals believed Montgomery was deliberately holding them in place. They believed he was trying desperately to break through and failing. Their decisions to concentrate panzers at KH were responses to real threats, not reactions to deception. When asked about the American breakout at St. Lo, German generals admitted they had been surprised by its success. They had expected the Americans to grind forward slowly as they had in the hedge. The speed of Cobra and Patton's exploitation caught them unprepared. The German testimony destroyed Montgomery's post-war narrative. He hadn't been conducting a brilliant deception operation. He had been trying to break through at Caen and failing repeatedly. The Germans had concentrated against him because he was attacking, not because they were being fooled. American success came despite Montgomery's failures, not because of them. The numbers tell the story that official histories tried to obscure. First, U.S. Army suffered over 62,000 casualties in Normandy, 20,000 killed in action, the rest wounded or missing. These were casualties incurred while fighting in the Bocage while Montgomery was stuck at Caen. How many of those casualties were preventable? How many American soldiers died because Montgomery failed to break through and open up the front? The question is impossible to answer precisely, but the strategic analysis is clear. If Montgomery had taken Caen on D-Day as promised, the Allies would have had room to maneuver. American forces wouldn't have been trapped in the Bocage for 6 weeks. The breakthrough would have come in June, not late July. The casualties would have been lower. German generals confirmed this assessment. They stated that if Caen had fallen quickly, they couldn't have held the Allies in Normandy. The entire defensive strategy depended on holding Caen and keeping the Allies contained. Montgomery's failure to take Caen allowed that strategy to work. The casualty exchange rate in the Bocage was horrific. American divisions lost 32, 50% of their infantry strength in the first weeks. Companies were rebuilt multiple times. In the Bocage, the attrition rate for riflemen was nearly 90% in some units. It got so bad that by July, the U.S. Army was running out of infantry. Cooks, clerks, and mechanics were being handed rifles and sent to the front lines to fill the gaps left by Montgomery's delay. The 7th Corps alone suffered 11,000 casualties in July during the fighting leading up to Cobra. Every one of those casualties has a name. Everyone has a family that received a War Department telegram. Everyone paid the price for Montgomery's broken promise on D-Day. Patton's breakout reduced casualties by restoring mobility. Once American forces broke into open country, the casualty rate dropped. Mobile warfare favored the side with air superiority and superior logistics, the Americans. The Bocage had favored the defenders, and Montgomery had trapped Americans in the Bocage for 6 weeks. Montgomery promised to take Caen on D-Day and failed after 6 weeks. Patton broke out of Normandy and advanced 250 miles in 3 weeks. One general was cautious, methodical, and failed. The other was aggressive, opportunistic, and succeeded. The Normandy campaign succeeded despite Montgomery, not because of him. American soldiers broke through where British forces had failed. American armor exploited where British forces had stalled. American aggression won the campaign that British caution nearly lost. Montgomery's promise that he would take Caen on D-Day was the foundation of the Overlord Plan. When that promise broke, the entire campaign had to be rebuilt around American success. Bradley and Patton delivered what Montgomery couldn't. That's the truth. History tried to forget. Montgomery failed at Normandy. Patton saved D-Day. And American soldiers paid the price for British incompetence.